We got a great talk that I put together, and it's it's really what I would call sort of step 2 in method development. Like, what if C18 does not work? So I want to take you through a little bit of, remind you of method development, and then really get you into thinking about alternative columns. C18 is by far the #1 column out there. If you look at the number of column sales, about 85% of all column sales are reverse phase columns, the majority of those being C8 and C18s. So it's a fantastic column. It usually works, but what do we do when it doesn't? That's sort of the theme of this talk. So first, I got to give a shout out to my old mentor, Harold McNair, world's greatest guy, world's greatest chromatographer, passed away a couple of years ago. But he taught me and a bunch of us chromatography, and our job is to go out and teach the rest of you guys. So that's sort of the, McNair, besides being the greatest chromatographer, he started the 2 biggest GC companies in the world. He did that before he turned 35 years old. He also put 2 GC mass specs on Mars, and pretty cool guy, pretty impressive guy. So let's jump into some LC stuff. And I always say that HPLC is the world's most powerful separation tool. Now, GC, I say, is the world's most popular separation tool, LC, the world's most powerful. And the reason I say that is because we have the ability to separate an unknown number of compounds by HPLC. In GC, ultimately, we're limited by volatility, but LC, we're really not limited by that. And in LC, I describe GC as a 2-dimensional separation, whereas where we get to the HPLC, we're in the 3 dimensions. So we have that extra dimension to help us do the really difficult separations. So in HPLC, what does it do better than any other technique? It separates complex mixtures into pure compounds. So we inject a sample, and the compounds travel through, and they come off one at a time. So why do we separate? We separate to identify, we separate to quantify, we separate to purify. So no matter what your ultimate goal is in HPLC, step 1 is to separate. Whether you want to identify something, you want to know how much something is in the sample, whether you want to purify something, you gotta do step 1, and that is to separate. Most people think this is really complicated because they think, oh my gosh, HPLC has so many variables. We got column length and particle size and flow rate and temperatures, and how do I make sense out of all of it? But it turns out that there's only 3 things that can affect your separation. And you are in charge of all 3. So let me show you what they are. Let me prove to you that you're in charge of them. And then we're going to sort of jump into the what to do if the simple stuff does not work. Okay, so we have this master resolution equation. It describes everything in HPLC, GC, SFC, reverse phase, normal phase. It is the fundamental equation. And the cool thing is it's always correct. In other words, if you put in the correct 3 terms, I guarantee that you will get a separation. So the only 3 things you need are capacity, selectivity, and efficiency. So first, a set of rules. We want resolution to be at least 1.5. That is the sort of mathematical definition of good resolution. So in HPLC, we're scientists. We put numbers on things. We don't say a separation is sort of good, really good, very good. We put a number on it. Is it greater than 1.5? Yes? Well, then I accept your results. Less than 1.5? I don't accept your results. So we have a real simple threshold that really can help us into the what is the validity of the data, and I could sort of figure that out by by looking at this, by looking at the resolution. So resolution 1.5 or greater. How do we get there? Well, we got our capacity factor, and capacity factor we want it to be between 1 and 5, and this is the solvent strength. So we're going to adjust the solvent strength to be weak enough to allow our analytes to interact with the stationary phase. So that's our job as analysts. Let's choose a set of conditions where we encourage our molecules to interact. That is, mathematical definition, capacity factor greater than 1. So capacity factor, also called the retention factor, is something that will tell us, have we allowed the analytes enough time in the stationary phase to separate? So before we choose a good stationary phase, first we have to start using the stationary phase, and that means make the mobile phase weaker. In HPLC, since most of us are doing reverse phase, that means adding more water to the mobile phase. We go 10% increments. 10% more water will roughly double your capacity factor. So we have good control of the first term, capacity factor, simply by playing with solvent strength. The second term is selectivity. We have a goal. 1.2 is our goal. How do we get there? Well, this is really a function of the chemistry. The chemistry of the stationary phase, the chemistry of the mobile phase, the pH, the temperature, a lot of things, but they all have to do with chemistry. So easy to calculate it. a little more difficult to understand. So selectivity is usually the hand wave, and then we sort of jump into doing everything else in detail. So the way I look at selectivity is it's purely it is primarily a function of the stationary phase and the mobile phase. So if we change those two, we can actually change the selectivity. And that's what we're going to talk about. What do we do if C18 doesn't work? One of the great ways to change selectivity is to go to some other alternative type of column. And then finally, we have efficiency. Efficiency is just a mechanical measure of sort of the goodness of the column. So it's a function of the column length, the particle size, the flow rate, and so forth. So this is something that we can optimize. We can buy a column with more efficiency by buying a longer column or smaller diameter particles, or we can choose a better flow rate, or we can minimize extra column volume. So these are all ways that we can improve efficiency. So that's the whole world of resolution. That's sort of like what we need to solve this equation for every unknown that we have coming in the lab. And the cool thing is, there's a pretty simple way to go about solving it. Okay, our goal is 1.5. We want to touch that baseline. We really don't like peaks that don't touch the baseline. We don't like the valley because we're going to assign some peaks, some molecules to the wrong peak. In other words, we have some of the first peak tailing into the second, some of the second fronting into the first. So we really want to make sure we touch the baseline in between the peaks. So now let's talk about method development. Step one, we want to start with a really high efficiency column. I like, again, 10 centimeter, 3.5 micron, that's like a 14,000 plate column. If you got the 1.8 micron particles, you get 10 centimeters of that. My gosh, you're in the 25,000, 28,000 plate area. So I like to start with a really high efficiency column. That way, efficiency is no longer really a variable. I mean, I can't double it because I can't get a longer, that much more efficiency. So let's start with a good number. You got 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 plates. That's a good number to start with because that's enough to do most separations. The next thing we're going to look at is the selectivity, and this is the stationary phase and the mobile phase. So in HPLC, we oftentimes think about changing the stationary phase right away, but we have the ability to also change the mobile phase, and that has a major impact on the separation, on the selectivity. So my favorite cartoon for this is, of course, the big equation, and then a miracle occurs. Well, that's reverse phase. So it's not really a miracle, it's science. So reverse phase is hydrophobic interaction. It is how nonpolar is your molecule. So no matter what change you put to a molecule, you are going to change its hydrophobicity, you will change its retention by reverse phase. So that's why reverse phase is what I call almost a universal approach at separations. So we've got good efficiency, we've got our good selectivity with reverse phase. This is again why we like reverse phase, because since the column is very nonpolar, it's going to attract the nonpolar part of your molecule. So all of your molecules, any carbon in the molecule, will get attracted to that stationary phase. The more carbon you have, the more attraction. So anything you change to a molecule, if you add any functional group, you'll change its hydrophobicity. If you add a methyl group, if you add a methoxy group, if you add a hydroxyl group, if you add an amino group, a carbonyl group, an acid group, any of these changes the polarity of the molecule, which changes its retention, and that's why we love this concept of reverse phase. So the last term is capacity factor. Capacity factor is simple. We just went through this earlier, and that is we just need to find the right mobile phase strength to allow the analytes to interact with the column. And it's a simple way to do that. We're going to do a gradient, and we're going to try every mobile phase strength in the world. So we're going to go from 10 to 100%. We're going to do that in 15 minutes, and that's going to show you all the peaks that are in your sample. So a gradient, there's 3 simple rules. The initial condition is wherever the first peak is coming off. So if your first peak is coming off at 22%, then you should start your analysis, start the gradient next time at 22%. So that is sort of the, there's no magic there. The peak is telling you what mobile phase it likes. So initial condition must be weak enough to give the first peak a capacity factor of 1. The final condition has to be strong enough to get the last peak off the column, right? You can't leave it there, got to take it off. So the only thing we really need to decide is how fast we get from initial to final. So the faster you get there, the steeper the gradient, the lower the resolution, but it's faster. So the longer the gradient time, the more shallow the gradient, it takes longer, but you get more resolution. So all you have to do is decide how much resolution you want, how long you're willing to wait. So this is an example of what the different gradient slopes look like. You could tell that we're squeezing peaks together at the 5-minute gradient. We're stretching them apart with a 40-minute gradient. I sort of describe this as writing the chromatogram on a rubber band, where you could stretch it out as much as you want, or you can compress it as much as you want just by changing that gradient time. It's a really powerful tool that we have in HPLC. So this is an unknown, and we run it typically 10 to 100%. We see 5 peaks. We see plenty of extra resolution in between the peaks. So we're just going to go to a much steeper gradient. So instead of a 15-minute gradient, we'll try a 5-minute or a 2-minute or a 1-minute. And we keep going until we get the separation, until we get the resolution we want. So in this example, this is a real sample that we run here in the lab that let's say there's a bunch of people in this lab who are about to receive this sample as an unknown, so they should be paying attention right now. So this is a 25-minute run, and if you keep playing with that gradient time and do it right, yes, you can get it down to a half-minute run. Ooh, I shouldn't have shown that. So I don't expect people to get down to half a minute. That's like really, really, but you know, there's some smart people in this group, so we might be bumping up. You might see a new slide the next time with a shorter analysis time the next time. So that's what we get. If you just follow my simple steps of method development, you do a good gradient on a good basic activated column, 10 to 100%, boom, it solves your problems running a C18 column. But what if it doesn't work? I always say this is sort of like 85% of the problems will solve by doing this. But that means 15% of the people are left out. Their problems are not solved. So how do we deal with that? So now it's time to look at a little more difficult level of method development. So this is my own nomenclature. No one else uses this nomenclature, but I say there's 3 levels of method development. Level 1 is what I just told you. You have a sample on one good basic activated column, wide gradient, that's going to work for you. It usually works. If it doesn't, why doesn't it work? There's math here. The reason is it doesn't work. You got good capacity factor, you got good efficiency, it means you don't have the right selectivity. So now it's time to change the chemistry. So we are going to, the first thing that I say is, let's change the mobile phase. It's the easiest thing to do. It has an impact on the separation. I'll admit the stationary phase chemistry has bigger impact, but the mobile phase chemistry is a lot easier to do. So if you do your first set of runs with acetonitrile, simply switch to methanol. Do it again. And I bet it's going to work. If you're using methanol, switch to acetonitrile. If you're using both, switch to THF, and one of those is likely to work because we are changing the one thing that's wrong. We're changing your selectivity, and by changing it, the way I feel is if you got no selectivity, you're at the bottom of the valley. You know, anything you do is got to be better. Then we get to level 3 of method development, and that's what we're about to enter. And that to me says, you've tried all the simple stuff, you've tried all the different solvents, and it still doesn't work, time to change the stationary phase. I look at this as experimental design. I want 3 different stationary phases, and I want to run them with 3 different mobile phases and really generate a lot of data before I make the next decision. So this is something that it's fun. It's a talk I've given a million times. It gets good, people seem to like it, but I always stop there, like, oh, and if it doesn't work for you, try a different column. But now it's time to talk about those different columns. So thanks to my friends at MacMod and ACE for providing some slides. And as I was putting together these talks, I'm looking at some great work that was out there. I was like, oh, I like that slide. So thanks to my MacMod buddies for getting me these. So this is sort of cool. This is, ACE makes a bunch of different columns. This is a C8. We're starting with, and it's like, what can we do to modify, if we go to a different stationary phase, what's it going to do? Well, if we simply change the length of the carbon chain, if we go from an A to an 18, we get the exact same separation, but more of it, right? Same thing, but more retention. We go down to a C4, same order, same thing, but less retention. So changing the column, the length of the chain is not going to change the order of separation, it's not going to do any of that, but it will bring peaks in earlier or later. So it's interesting, but there's not much chemistry difference there. Now, if we go over to the other side and we start looking at a cyano or a phenyl column, we are now adding a different chemistry, and look at the order. Instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they're coming off in different order. Anytime you see change in order, that means you have changed the selectivity. So I feel my job is to teach you how to change selectivity. I can't really teach you how to make it better, but I can teach you how to change it. And that's really what you need to know. So, so let's go on and talk about different columns. So before we move away from a C18, I think a decent statement is You know, not all C18s are the same. A C18 is not a C18. Now, they're all 18 carbons, but it's how they're bonded. It's what the matrix is what the silica looks like. So this is a neat example. These are difficult separation, but you're seeing them on a bunch of different C18s. Now, this was provided by the folks at ACE, so they chose a mixture that worked on theirs, but it's a really valid set of chromatograms because it shows you that we do have slightly different selectivity, even though if you look at for the most part, all the peaks are coming off in the same order, but the relative orders are a little different. We see those coelutions happening. So that says not all C18s are the same, so I think is the first takeaway. The next statement is let's look at that master resolution equation. And the first thing is, good news is, look, I'm not the only one who does it. I'm not the only geek in the world. Here's the folks at MacMod. They're using the same slide. This was actually originally done by Professor Peter Carr at University of Minnesota. Did cool work, did great work. My friends at ResTech, hey, got the same slide. So let me explain this slide. This slide says you got 3 ways to improve resolution. But if you look at it mathematically, capacity factor will only get you so far. You get up to capacity factor of 5, you've gotten about as much as there's to get from the term. You could take it to 10 to get a little more, but if you keep going 20, 30, 40, 50, you don't get any more resolution, you just wait longer. So capacity factor sort of tops out around 5. So the next term, efficiency. More efficiency is always better, but notice it's not a straight line. It's a little bit of an exponential, right? Because efficiency goes up, but resolution goes up by the square root of efficiency. So if you double it, square root of 2, 1.41, so you get 40% more resolution every time you double the length, so you're going to sort of get this curve. But if you look at the line for selectivity, it's a straight line. It keeps going up forever. So mathematically, this says, wow, we should all jump in and study selectivity. I agree with that, but before you do that, let's get those other 2 optimized first, because if I want you to give me more capacity factor, if I have capacity factor of 1 and I ask your advice, what should I do to my mobile phase? I think you're going to say, well, you need to weaken your mobile phase. So, so that is the right answer. We get us up to that capacity factor of 5. If I want you to give me a column with more efficiency, we could ask this whole group here. They'll say, hey, Lee, you need a longer column with smaller particles. But if I ask for more selectivity, I think we're all going to say, I'll teach you how to change it, but I can't teach you how to improve it. That's up to you. So let me teach you. So the tool you need is how do we change selectivity? And now let me take us down that path of changing stationary phases. So before we do that, I think this math is sort of cool. These are just mathematical simulations, but I think it gets you to understand the importance of each term. So here's the separation we have. Resolution 1.8, about 10,000 plates. So you can tell we just sort of put the equation together and came up with a number. 1.8, it's good. So what if we double the plates? What if I get a column twice as long or half the particle size? I got 20,000 plates. That makes it better. It goes from 1.8 to 2.6. Okay, 40% improvement, right? We double the length, we go up by the square root of 2. Fantastic. How about my capacity factor? Well, if I improve capacity factor, now in all honesty, this starts at 4, so it's already really good, and goes from 4 to 8 and says, yeah, it helps a little bit, 1.8 to 2.0, but not really going out there and pulling things apart. So if we then look at playing with selectivity, even if we change selectivity by a little bit, 1.1 to 1.2, we see a huge improvement in the resolution. So by looking at this, it sort of says, okay, we should spend some time understanding selectivity and figuring out how to change it, because there is a lot of bang for the buck there. So now let's look at different the ideas of different things that affect selectivity. This is a great chart because it says isocratically, the number one thing that affects your selectivity is your stationary phase. Second thing is the mobile phase, blah, blah. When you're doing a gradient, it's all those plus the gradient shape, right, the steepness of the curve. So let's first look at stationary phases. The first thing we're always going to try is going to be a C18. So I thought, what kind of probe, what kind of mix can we use? Cannabinoids are difficult to separate. I think it's CBD and CBG that are challenging. So I thought, hey, we got a mix here that we have problem separating. Actually, we have a lot of problems separating these. So I thought this would be a good one to play with. So the first thing we're going to do, we're going to inject those 5 compounds onto a really good C18. This is Eclipse Plus from Agilent, my favorite column. Works great, but in this case, I see 4 peaks, but I really don't see 5. Well, I see a split peak up front. So this doesn't have the selectivity. that peak, that split peak, is reasonably well retained. It's got a good capacity factor. So I didn't measure exactly, but it's probably sitting at a capacity factor of 3 or 4. So we've given it plenty of time, but we just don't have the right chemistry. Okay, so C18 doesn't seem to work. So now let's go down that path. So the first column we looked at is a pentafluorophenyl, and these are neat. These are a hot topic out there. And what we're doing here is we are modifying the chemistry of the column. So we still have those beautiful C18s hanging out there, but we have this pentafluorophenyl with this electronegative sort of group hanging out there. And I think of this as, we're going to do interactions, those electronegativity kind of interactions. In this case, sounds cool, but doesn't do it for us. And in fact, now we only see 3 peaks. Remember, we're expecting 5. So we've gone from 4.5 down to 3. This is not a bad column. This is not a bad stationary phase. It is the wrong stationary phase for this application. Don't throw that column away. We're just going to use it for something else. So let's keep going. After these are the evospheres columns. So then we went to the C12. The C12, I think it's interesting. They make this instead of a C18. It's really similar, and the reason is you could put more C12s onto a column than you can C18s. It has to do with bonding density. C18s are very big. It's hard to fit 2 C18s next to each other. So by using C12s, they get more bonding density. Really nice column, beautiful peak shapes. This was probably my favorite peak shapes when I looked at it, but unfortunately there's only 4 peaks. We're looking for 5. That first peak is 2 peaks. It's CBD and CBG. They're co-eluting, like perfectly co-eluting. We have no difference at all in their retentions, no hump or anything on the peak. So we keep going. So this, I really didn't expect this to work because the C18 didn't work, but it's worth trying. So then let's move on to a phenyl. So phenyl is neat because we now have that benzene ring. We've got pi electrons, we got dipole interaction, inducible dipole. We have the ability to interact with molecules differently. And different is the key word when it comes to selectivity. But it doesn't do it for us. Sounds cool, neat column, great column for a lot of stuff. In this one, doesn't seem to pull those 2 apart. Okay, we got more columns. We're not quitting. How about this one? If 1 benzene ring is good, 2 is better, right? My buddy, the Fagan brothers over at MacMod, I think that's one of their favorite statements. So I have this diphenyl. Well, I've got 2 benzene rings. In fact, they're floating out there, and they could float in 3-dimensional space, and they can interact with any plane of your molecule. But doesn't do it for us here. It's sort of neat. We're getting something, right? That first peak is broad because we're starting to resolve them, but clearly nothing that we're going to write home about. Okay, we're not going to quit. We go to the next one, and oh my gosh, that's an amide column, and boom, it worked. So this is just we didn't go try and optimize things. We just sort of did the first kind of run, gave good conditions that it should have separated. So in each one of those, we did it the same with this one, and the first run, boom, just those first 2 peaks just fell apart. Beautiful example of where selectivity changes things. Now this is an amide column. This is one of my favorite alternative columns. My favorite column is a C18, base activated C18, but when it doesn't work, I really like to go to this column because this is what we call a polar embedded phase. They call it an amide. You go polar embedded. It means we take that C18 and down near the bottom we stick in a polar group, an amide or a carbamate. That allows the C18 to stand up straight in pure water, and that is really cool. We could do reverse phase even starting at 0% acetonitrile, and it's still a C18, so we can still go up to 100% acetonitrile. So I love the amide phases. I find that this is a great example. It's really meant for high water content for very polar things, but I always say it's a polar entity on that column. It's going to do some polar interaction, and in this case, it was enough to separate the first 2 peaks. So I think it's sort of a good example of let's try different columns, and let's see which one has the right selectivity. So if we go back to that slide that talked about, hey, what affects selectivity? Number 1, absolute column is the biggest effect. But the second effect, the second biggest, is the mobile phase. So I think back to Lloyd Snyder, one of the great theoreticians in HPLC, and Lloyd Snyder taught us that different solvents solvate differently. So methanol is a proton donor, proton acceptor. Acetonitrile's got that triple bond hanging out there. THF is totally different than the other ones. So he said, if you change the mobile phase, the chemistry of the mobile phase, you're actually changing the selectivity. So let's take a look at different mobile phases. So everything we've run so far has been methanol. I start with methanol, then I move to acetylnitrile if methanol doesn't work. Why? Methanol's a lot cheaper. I just bought it $100 a case at VWR. So thank you, VWR. So it's a high-grade methanol. Acetylnitrile is about $600 and up a case. So I start with methanol, and if it doesn't work, I try acetylnitrile. So in this example, we started with our pentaphenyl. Remember the one we all made fun of that looked really funny? We only got 3 peaks. Oh my gosh, we actually get 5 peaks. So acetylnitrile is stronger than methanol. In this case, it looks like a lot stronger. So we should go back and adjust conditions and play a little bit. So again, we didn't do any optimization, but very first run with acetylnitrile, boom, we see the 5th peak. That's real. That's, I would say, if you try methanol first and move to acetylnitrile, I'd be tempted to do that before I change the column. But let's keep going. Let's compare some other ones. So was our C12, beautiful peaks. And all of a sudden, 4 beautiful peaks turns into 5 beautiful peaks. Yeah, great separation, beautiful peak shapes. I'm sort of hot on this one. I'm not giving that column back. We got these someone loaned us these columns, but they may not. You're not gonna see this one back. I'm gonna play with this one more. So looks really cool. Just by going to acetylnitrile, got that selectivity. Let's go on and look at the phenyl column. And the phenyl, all of a sudden it starts working. It's amazing that acetylnitrile seemed to make every one of these better. Well, almost every one of them better. But here we get our 5 peaks by looking at using the phenyl group, using those pi electrons. The biphenyl, okay, if 1 is good, 2 is better. Well, maybe 2 is not always better, but it's interesting, very different selectivity. Worth pursuing, worth playing with this column, but we've seen so many beautiful ones already that this one's going to be way down on the list. And then we get to my favorite, I should say my favorite alternative column, the amide column. Unfortunately, acetylnitrile made this one a little worse. I don't know, not much, a little worse, but that's real. So when you change selectivity, that's why I keep saying change. I cannot teach you how to make it better, because if you make it better for one set of peaks, like if you see peaks 3 and 4, they got better with acetylnitrile. But peaks 1 and 2, selectivity got worse with acetylnitrile. So that's the reality. When you change the selectivity, you are changing selectivity. It could go up, it could go down, and every pair of peaks is different. But following those rules sort of that I gave you, start with a good base activated C18. I really like trying the methanol and the acetylnitrile, but the idea of doing multiple columns, this was really easy work. It's like 2 days of work. Oh, actually, it was easy work because I didn't do it. Eleanor Westerbeck, my associate here, I made her do all the work. So it was easy for me. But no, this is like a day's worth of work really to evaluate all 5 columns. Okay, so thank you for joining me. Thanks for showing up for this webinar. Just as a reminder, if you're looking to hang out in Chicago for a week, if you're looking to learn chromatography, this is a cool place to do it. 5 days take you from wherever you are now to an advanced level, and we have some fun along the way. Yeah, we do. Okay, special thanks to my buddies at MacMod for supplying the columns and the entertainment. They're fun to hang out with. And also thanks again to Eleanor, one of the scientists here, because I gave her this as a project. In fact, okay, we submitted this as a paper we're going to present this at the ACS meeting in Denver in the fall. So this is sort of our step 1, part 1 of it. And I see a lot of legs to this one. I see a lot of things that are worth pursuing. So we're going to keep playing with this, and we'll tell you what we find out.